Okay, let's unpack this. A potential bankruptcy for the UK. Maybe in what, 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark warning to start with, isn't it? Came from Steve Baker.
Right. And it's not just, the usual national debt figures. We're talking, what was it? 2.8 trillion pound in unfunded public sector pensions.
And another 5.6 trillion for the state pension. Added up.
That's 8.4 trillion. Trillion. In promises we haven't figured out how to pay for, it's more than 3 times the current national debt.
Wow. Makes you really stop and think, how on earth future generations are meant to handle that?
Yeah.
Or what kind of drastic measures might eventually be needed?
Exactly. And it's not just the sheer size of the numbers, is it? It's what they actually represent.
Precisely. A massive gap between what's been promised, entitlements, and the actual resources set aside to meet them. It's a fundamental challenge.
Yeah, and as Baker and the others in this discussion point out, it really casts this long shadow over the UK's whole economic future.
Absolutely. So that's kind of our jumping off point for this deep dive.
Right. We've pulled some key bits from a recent YouTube discussion. It featured Steve Baker, the MP James Van Straten, who's a Bitcoin strategist, and Peter McCormack.
A lively mix.
Definitely. So think of this as your quick way to get the gist of their views on the economy right now. Their critiques, quite sharp critiques of government policies.
And some, let's say, unconventional ideas about solutions they're exploring.
Yeah, exactly. What you've got here is, well, it's a pretty intense conversation between people who are clearly worried, deeply worried, about where the UK economy is heading.
And they're not just finger pointing. They seem to be trying to dig into the root causes, and actively looking for different ways forward.
We're basically going to try and distill their main arguments for you, pull out the insights that make you go, okay, and there were definitely a few of those.
Keep the jargon down, give you a clearer picture of their analysis.
Yep, the mission today is pretty straightforward. Understand the core worries and the alternative solutions these guys are putting on the table. So where do we start with all this complexity?
Well, I think the obvious place is, what are the big underlying problems they see in the UK economy? And Steve Baker's view, because he's been talking about this for ages, seems like a good place to begin.
Right, Baker. He's been banging this drum for a while, hasn't he? Even back in 2010, just after he became an MP.
Yeah, he was already sensing something wasn't right, an impending crisis.
And his diagnosis, basically. Too much government spending consistently, and what he saw as the currency being debased, weakened, especially after the 2008 crash.
He had that phrase, didn't he? Easy money and too much government is corrosive.
Yeah, corrosive. And that feeling, that basic idea, it seems like all three of them in this chat kind of share it.
What's interesting is how consistent he's been. It wasn't just a reaction to, the crisis of the day. He saw it as a systemic thing, baked into the monetary system.
When he says corrosive of everything, it really hits home how deep his concern goes about the long-term impact on society, not just spreadsheets.
Yeah, essentially, the government creating more money out of thin air, which eventually makes the money in your pocket worth less. Things get more expensive. Inflation.
And it's not just looking back. They all seem pretty disappointed, maybe even disillusioned with how governments have performed, not just here, but internationally, too.
It almost sounds like they're questioning the whole point of government sometimes. What it should actually be doing.
Yeah, there's this real sense of the old ways aren't working, that the usual approaches just aren't cutting it anymore.
Maybe a fundamental rethink is needed about government's purpose, its limits.
And remember Baker's speech back in 2014, nearly 10 years ago now. He specifically warned about easy money, cheap credit.
Creating asset bubbles, right?
Especially housing.
Exactly. And he had this really strong view, almost fatalistic, that the current monetary system, the way things are run now, needs to be. Well, his words were tested to destruction.
Wow.
Before any real change could happen. That's a pretty intense belief. It is striking. It suggests he thinks, tinkering around the edges won't work. Minor reforms aren't enough.
That maybe it takes a proper crisis to force a shift to a new system.
Now, Peter McCormack brings up something else, this idea of massive amounts of wasting government money.
Yes. He mentions talking to people behind the Dodge files and procurement file.
Right, and those references, they make it very concrete, don't they? It moves from just economic theory to specific examples of alleged mismanagement, taxpayer money supposedly just frittered away.
Paints a picture of huge inefficiency.
And a theme that keeps coming up is this feeling that there's just not enough Deep economic understanding within government, across all the parties.
They use that analogy, don't they? Treating the UK government like a badly run company drowning in debt.
It's a powerful comparison. It suggests a lack of basic financial discipline, the kind you'd expect anywhere else, let alone running a major economy. It's quite a damning view.
And interestingly, they even get into MP pay rises. The independent body, IPSA, sets that.
Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority, yeah.
Their point wasn't really about the amount itself. It's about 3 times the median wage. Apparently £35,000 is the median.
Right.
But that the pay level doesn't necessarily guarantee you get the most competent people. That money isn't the main reason most people go into politics.
Which is an interesting thought about incentives, isn't it? You need fair pay, sure, but maybe the skills and motivations needed for good governance aren't always the ones driven purely by wanting to get rich.
So what does drive them? Makes you wonder.
And all this links back to that growing squeeze people feel, doesn't it? The gap between earnings and the cost of living. Housing, energy, food.
Yeah.
It's hitting hard.
Yeah. They do make an interesting side note, though, that food price inflation has actually been higher in the EU since Brexit.
Which just adds another layer of complexity. Suggests it's not just Brexit, but maybe wider global factors pushing up costs, too. Not simple.
Definitely not simple. Then there's this phrase, managed decline. McCormack seems to think it might actually be deliberate, a conscious policy.
Whereas Baker leans more towards incompetence, perhaps. A lack of guts or brain power to make the hard choices needed.
Either way, it sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? Intentional or incompetent decline. Not great options.
No. If it's intentional, that's quite cynical. If it's incompetence, well, that's just deeply worrying about the ability to actually govern effectively.
So, okay, lots of problems identified. What about ways forward? Potential solutions?
Well, Baker's pretty consistent here. He talks a lot about honest money and reforming institutions.
And he's a big proponent of Bitcoin, isn't he?
Yeah.
Sees it as practical, peer-to-peer money outside of state control.
Exactly. And he even talks about removing hurdles for other alternatives, like treating gold as actual money again.
You mean like no VAT, no capital gains tax on it, maybe even letting people pay taxes with gold?
That's the kind of radical thinking he's suggesting. A fundamental shift away from state-controlled fiat currency.
Wow. That's a big change. And Van Straten, the Bitcoin strategist, he chimes in with a personal story.
Yeah, about choosing Bitcoin over property during COVID.
Right. He apparently anticipated inflation and rising interest rates hitting the housing market. Made a bet on Bitcoin instead.
And he has that quite bold prediction that one Bitcoin could eventually be worth the same as an average house price.
Which is a pretty wild thought. But he backs it up, or at least illustrates it, with a chart.
The one showing housing priced in Bitcoin.
Yeah. And visually, it really drives home how much Bitcoin has appreciated against, a major traditional asset like property.
It's striking. That chart reframes Bitcoin, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not just speculation, but maybe a store of value that's massively outperformed the usual go-to, like bricks and mortar.
Of course, you've got the Bank of England pushing back hard on this, the governor warning people they could lose everything if they invest in Bitcoin.
That highlights the tension, doesn't it? The established financial system versus these new decentralized alternatives. Central banks are worried about losing control, maintaining stability.
Understandably, perhaps. Now, this whole economic picture seems to be weighing particularly heavily on younger generations.
Yeah, they definitely touch on that. The huge hurdles young people face just trying to hit those traditional milestones, buying a house, starting a family, mostly down to crazy house prices.
It's a key point. This feeling that the path their parents or grandparents took is just much, much harder now. Raises big questions about fairness, social mobility.
Baker and McCormack even talk about their dad's generation. Getting on the housing ladder was doable, often on one income.
Now, usually needs 2 incomes, and even then it's a massive stretch. There's even this quite cynical idea floated.
That maybe it's deliberate, to break up a nuclear family somehow or just keep house prices pumped up.
It's a contentious view for sure, but it shows the level of frustration, maybe even paranoia people feel when faced with these economics, a sense that the system's rigged against them.
Van Straten picks up on that too. Sees younger people feeling stuck. Points to things like the rising average age for marriage, falling birth rates.
But he also stresses personal responsibility, right? That individuals still need to navigate these challenges themselves.
He does, though you could argue individual effort alone might not be enough if the systemic economic headwinds are that strong. It's a tough balance.
Okay, switching gears a bit, they also get into the political side of things. Democracy. the current landscape.
The idea that culture wars are maybe easier politics, easier to get votes with than, complex economic arguments.
Right. And apparently not many MPs actually turn up for debates on monetary policy. Maybe because it's complex, maybe lack of understanding.
Which is worrying if true, isn't it? A
Yeah.
disconnect between what's debated politically and the fundamental economics affecting everyone's lives.
Yeah. And there's this feeling that the main parties, Labor and the Conservatives, aren't that different ideologically anymore.
Just presiding over this gradual decline, maybe.
And that perception seems to be fueling the rise of these reform parties, offering something different. Their appeal often seems to be about seeming more authentic.
That blurring of lines between the big parties definitely creates space for alternatives, people promising radical change. And voters seem hungry for authenticity, for politicians who seem straight-talking.
Though, of course, they also critique some of those alternative parties, too, questioning their fiscal plans.
Naturally.
Yeah.
And they talk about how hard it is, even for someone like Kemi Badenoch who might want radical reform, to actually implement it. Party management, fear of voter backlash.
It shows the constraints, doesn't it? Even if you know change is needed, actually doing it in a democracy with party politics and elections is incredibly difficult.
Definitely. Then they mentioned the Bank of England's new repo facility,
Yeah.
providing emergency cash against government bonds.
And one of them calls it a Ponzi scheme. Pretty strong language.
Very strong. It reflected deep distrust in the current financial fixes.
Yeah.
And they see gold hitting all-time highs as another warning sign.
Yeah, gold often seen as that safe haven when people are worried about the economy, about the system itself.
Exactly. Then they circle back to the Liz Truss period, the fallout from her policies.
The bond market reaction, yeah. Yields spiking. That fear the UK was starting to look like an emerging market.
And the vulnerability that exposed, particularly with those LDI strategies pension funds were using. Leveraged investments that got caught out when rates rose fast after being so low during COVID.
It really showed how interconnected policy, markets, and global perception are, and how quickly things can unravel.
Baker also had some thoughts on Truss's style, didn't he? Managing people, civil servants, advocated for more collaboration.
And they also highlight just how hard it is for any new chancellor to make quick changes because government spending commitments are so locked in, there's huge inertia.
It's a massive ship to turn around.
Plus, that fundamental political problem. The public generally wants lower taxes and more spending. How do you square that circle?
It's the perennial challenge, and they touch on the flaws in the whole manifesto process, too. Promises made that might not be deliverable.
Then there are the practical barriers for businesses. High business rates, VAT, complicated employment laws, energy costs.
Van Straten's cafe experience in Bedford comes up here, right?
Yeah.
A real-world example of those struggles.
Yeah, it makes it tangible. They're not keen on the entrepreneurial state idea either.
Seems they favor the private sector driving growth. And Van Straten mentions talking to Ed Miliband about Bitcoin mining.
As a way to use up excess wind power. And Miliband wasn't buying it.
Apparently not. Shows the clash of perspectives on energy, tech, government's role.
The conversation gets quite wide-ranging. They even bring in the fourth turning theory.
Yeah, the idea of historical cycles and that we're currently in a crisis phase, a winter, adds a sort of grand historical sweep to the discussion.
And those procurement files again. Wasteful spending examples. Porsches for Albanian prisons, was that one?
It sounds incredible, doesn't it? They critique the mainstream media for maybe not digging into this stuff enough.
And praise independent journalists, platforms like Twitter for uncovering things.
It highlights the changing media landscape and the need for scrutiny of how public money is spent.
They also point out the lack of a proper budgeting process in government compared to a well-run business. Another weakness.
And the trap politicians fall into, thinking big changes will be easy to implement. Underestimating the resistance, the complexity.
Also, the reasons wealthy people might be leaving the UK. High taxes, the general economic mood.
Which raises concerns about retaining talent and investment, doesn't it?
Definitely. And they even speculate on what happens if the whole fiat money system, our current government currency system, actually collapses. What that means even if you hold Bitcoin.
It's a reminder that even alternatives are connected to the wider system and underlines the need for really high-quality political leadership.
Which links to the point about the widening wealth gap. Reaching levels not seen since the Great Depression, they say.
That's a sobering thought. Huge potential for social instability there.
They acknowledge that most people aren't obsessed with the details of politics, rational disinterest, they call it.
Yeah, which makes things like podcasts, think tanks, even more important for shaping the debate influencing the conversation, and hopefully, eventually, policy.
Trying to break through the groupthink that can sometimes dominate mainstream media, get alternative ideas out there.
But it's hard, isn't it? They talk about the psychology people often resist changing their minds, even with evidence. Like the resistance some have to Bitcoin.
Hmm. And how different generations view these things. Younger people seem generally more open to alternative financial ideas.
That generational difference is interesting. Suggests maybe a slow shift in financial thinking over time.
They also touch on the UK stock market looking a bit dated compared to the US.
And the idea of property acting almost like a form of capital control. An interesting angle.
And then back to Bitcoin policy, could the UK develop one? What are the barriers? Banks closing accounts for crypto businesses is a real problem.
Yeah, that stifles innovation, doesn't it? Creates uncertainty. And the mystery around the UK government's own Bitcoin holdings?
From seizures, presumably. What are they doing with it? Could it be a strategic reserve? Lots of unknowns.
Indeed. And looking longer term, this clash between technology, AI, driving costs down, deflationary pressure.
Versus constant credit expansion, trying to inflate things.
Exactly. A huge tension. And maybe contemporary politics just isn't equipped to handle that pace of change. Perhaps needs more libertarian, hands-off approaches.
But selling libertarianism in government is tough, isn't it? The pull towards state intervention, offering free stuff, is strong.
Very strong politically.
Yeah.
And all this feeds into a sense of disconnect between the public and democracy. Falling voter turnout.
People feeling disengaged. Which brings us back to needing better politicians. But how do you attract the right talent into public service? It's a massive challenge.
The hope, perhaps, is that a better informed public starts demanding more, demanding better leadership, better solutions.
There's definitely this underlying feeling throughout their conversation that we're in a period of fundamental shift. Technology is driving huge changes in the economy and society. Things feel unsettled.
A sense that the old rules might not apply anymore.
Right. So let's try and pull this all together then. We've definitely heard some pretty grave warnings about the UK economy's path.
Sharp criticisms of government policies, monetary policy especially.
And a serious look at alternatives, with Bitcoin clearly being a major focus for some of them as a potential way forward.
And for me, one thing that really stood out was the scale of those unfunded pension liabilities, that 8.4 trillion figure.
Yeah, it dwarfs the official national debt figure we usually hear about. Suggests the long-term picture might be much shakier than many realize.
Absolutely.
So we really hope this deep dive has helped give you a quicker and clearer handle on these really complex issues and the different arguments being made.
Understanding these challenges, even if the solutions aren't simple, hopefully empowers you a bit more to navigate what's happening and maybe consider perspectives you hadn't before.
Definitely. And look, this chat has really just, scratched the surface.
Oh, for sure. There's so much more you could dig into. Things like that fourth turning theory, the details in the procurement files, the whole ongoing debate for and against Bitcoin.
Loads to explore further if you're interested. So maybe a final thought to leave you with. Given all these deep challenges to the way things have normally worked, economically speaking, are we actually on the verge of some kind of radical transformation? And what role might things like Bitcoin and, crucially, maybe a more informed, more engaged public play in whatever comes next?